Climate and dystopian fictions have long existed in our popular imaginations. From cli-fi to eco-horror, we are increasingly engaging our Anthropocene anxieties about ecological and sociocultural changes on a larger scale. These narratives allow us to express grief at what we perceive as inevitable ecological collapse. Dystopian games in particular allow us to role-play scenarios for humanity's future and serve as parables for ethical and unethical action. In this sense, I think representation of any and all elements matters greatly. Picking up on the theme of post-pandemic ruin, this paper offers a close reading of the game's affect in relation to discourses of media representation. I focus on three aspects of ruin: the abjection of Ellie and Abby's gender and sexuality, the ruin of a post-pandemic environment riddled with remnants of infrastructure, and the ruin of morality as a concept underpinning civil society. None of these ideas are new in gaming. However, I would argue that Last of Us Part 2 does an especially apt job at tailoring gender representation to the affective tone of a world in ruin. The morality in the game is necropastoral. The narrative structure gives the player no choices, no redemption, just pure survival violence. The player is forced to re-experience violence from different perspectives in the collapse of humanity's shared moral core. I want to start with two warnings. First, the talk contains a lot of spoilers, and second, it contains some gore and violence because we will be viewing footage from the game, and the gameplay is my own. Now let me take you back to April 2020, the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Amid the general contagion panic and worst-case fears coming to pass, there was a preoccupation with VR and escapism. Think of the global uptake of Animal Crossing, for example. There was an explosion of toolkits for entertaining kids at home, tools for arranging work and life from home, not only technologies but also lifestyle changes and hacks. The arts pivoted swiftly to visual exhibits, virtual performance, film festival viewings, virtual social spaces, and more. The question at the time was, what kind of media, what kind of atmosphere does one immerse themselves in? And for some reason, I just couldn't get into the happy, carefree escapism of Animal Crossing. But as the pandemic stretched on, I found unexpected gratification in the decaying world of Last of Us Part 2. Having recently finished the game, I still feel haunted by its eerie post-Anthropocene atmosphere, manifest in vast landscapes of long-decayed abandoned buildings, overgrown nature, and the melancholy of original Southern guitar soundtrack written by Gustavo Santaolalla and Mac Quayle. A combination of thriving post-human life and sorrowful guitar tunes form the unique emotional tone of the game environment. In First Person Scholar, a popular academic blog, Kat Goodfellow suggests that dystopian games give us a sandbox opportunity to reimagine the world differently by way of a post-anthropocenic concept, the necropastoral. She argues that reframing the relationship away from protagonist and story to the necropastoral affects of the post-apocalyptic environment provides generative new forms of play and imagination. I think one of the most poignant moments in the series for me was in the first Last of Us when Ellie and Joel go through an abandoned hotel, half submerged in the floods of Seattle. As Joel goes through empty banquet rooms, buffet tables still left with plates and utensils on them, unfinished, as if frozen in time when the pandemic wiped humanity. In the lobby of the same hotel, while rummaging through the decaying remains of the stairs and lobby bar, a bright sun ray shines through lush greenery, and the game offers you, the player, a most vibrant chorus of birds, both local and tropical, feathered survivors of humanity's demise. In that moment, the game's affect powerfully resonated with my real-world feelings about the loss of normalcy in 2020. A moment of sonic pleasure in the midst of eerie quietude and uncertainty. The ominous clicking sound of the infected starkly contrasts with these moments of pleasure. While clicks are a natural form of echolocation, the distorted, reverberant sound here is a reminder that something terrible has happened. As Tidwell and Souls point out in their collection on eco-horror in the Anthropocene, zombies here are not monsters per se, but representations of a monstrous agency that cannot be reduced to one entity. Last of Us Part 2 forces the player to navigate the aftermath of a global catastrophe, piecing together the story of what happened.
What happened out here? I'm guessing the military bombed the shit out of this place.
Why would they do that?
Well, they would sometimes destroy parts of the city that were lost to the infected. Or to rebels.
That seems like overkill.
Well, it usually worked.
On the infected or the rebels?
Both.
Shit.
Believe me, you're lucky you didn't grow up like Kizzy.
I'm starting to get that impression.
It is eerie to do so while experiencing a real-world pandemic. No zombies, but abandoned spaces nonetheless, quote-unquote, the end of normal. And this is very much language that has been used around catastrophizing stay-at-home mandates. The ecological disaster isn't directly named. The cordyceps virus merely caused the zombie-like symptoms, but the demise of humanity is in its very structure and organization of life. Military control, supply chain, resource management, global trade, all features of late-stage capitalism that also ensured the swift wipeout of huge populations. The environmental Anthropocene critique is evident throughout the game world, covered in lush ferns and filled with thriving bird and animal species. Vegetation in particular is abundant, with every plant species local to the Pacific Northwest and so firmly placing us on land and territory. Nature here is neither romanticized nor anthropomorphized. It exists in parallel and is unconcerned with me, the player. In his essay, Alternative Ethics for Eco-Cinema, John Landerville posits the notion of post-continuity aesthetics as a technique for camera work and montage that engender environmental ethics. While Last of Us Part 2 doesn't resist the player continuous visual world, it narratively insists on temporal fragmentation. The first part of the game, you play as Ellie, off to avenge Joel's death. The trip through dystopian Seattle is interspersed with interactive memories with Joel from their past 4 years in camp. At a pivotal point, however, the game forces you to switch avatars and play as Abby, Ellie's arch-enemy. Time rolls back to the beginning of the quest, and you, the player, has to experience the narrative from Abby's point of view. Not just performing game actions, but understanding their emotional motivations, their histories, their hurt and pain. You, the player, are the only witness to their similarities and to the futility of their respective factions. It is an empty experience functioning in this world where human factions are killing each other over land and resources while trying to stave off zombie invasions. It makes you want to scream at the screen for everyone to get along. But the quiet solitude of both young women is telling. It tells the story of what this is and how we got here, without the specific details. The story of the past is not events, it's an emotion, it's affect. And so is the tenuous morality that exists in the game world. is not a set of choices, but a sad inevitability. In another article on dystopian games from First Person Scholar, Gerald Voorhees argues that post-world stories allow us to imagine different social structures, including different gender norms in economic organizations. Reflecting on Ellie's queerness in Last of Us, Voorhees playfully terms the game's reception mourning sex, with spelling from mourn to grieve, echoing both the apocalyptic atmosphere and the crumbling of heteronormativity. So let's dive into gender representation. One of the first things to note is the game's almost entirely played with female characters from the point of view of Ellie and Abby. The game even features a lesbian romance between Ellie and Dina, and also a transgender character, Lev. Ellie's relationship with Joel from the first title, Last of Us, has been talked about a lot as a significant departure from the usual game mechanics of male superhero and female damsel in distress. While critiques of Ellie's limited role are fair, her bond with Joel is hardly hegemonic. Ellie equally rescues Joel as he rescues her. Typically, games with any sort of female characters in them have historically been associated with the male gaze. As a more progressive game, Last of Us Part 2 interrupts this tradition by very specifically not sexualizing Ellie. Even though both Abby and Ellie are both shown in sexual situations in the game, they're not objectified. In fact, they're almost abject. They almost repel a kind of male gaze. Both are wiry and strong, and Abby is described even in the game as being built like an ox. Brian McNair suggests that a media-rich environment has resulted in a democratization of desire, meaning that different bodies are now sexualized, including male bodies, gay bodies, lesbian bodies. In this case, we could also see Ellie and Abby as ready subjects of the lesbian gaze. While they repel a male gaze, they signal queerness in many ways and invite a queer way of looking.
Holy. Abby?
In examining new liberal forms of sexualization, Gill says that this process does not operate outside of processes of gendering, racialization, and classing, and works within a visual economy that remains profoundly ageist and heteronormative. Gill also reminds us that media is already a contradictory space for gender representation, because that's both where stereotypes persist and are challenged, evolving based on public discussion. In this sense, my own reading of Ellie and Abby is far from objectification and desire. As a queer player, I see them as non-normative women, yet I still read them as profoundly abject and not desirable. They are non-normative in very specific ways. The camera follows them without emphasizing typically sexualized areas, such as the butt or breasts. In fact, both women are quite flat-chested, and Abby, though narratively heterosexual, looks especially masculine. Her movements and gestures are very rugged, and that's a stark contrast to video game women who are often encoded moving with frailty and a conspicuous hip sway. Another thing I want to note is the sonic character of the game in general and the vocalizations of the playable leads. Theorists like Marianne Dwan and Kai Silverman point out that female voices in media have a history of being overtly gendered, as though through a male oral gaze. In contrast, Ellie and Abby are both quite naturalistic in the way they breathe and exert themselves.
Yes, you will.
Shira Chess suggests that games are queer narratives because they are interactive and thus lend themselves to counter-hegemonic behavior, such as avoiding killing, exploration rather than following the story arc, failing to win even. Last of Us 2 is quite a constrained narrative, and that's part of its emotional dystopian appeal. It moves you from area to area and requires you to clear, that is, eliminate enemies to progress. There isn't much open world to explore. Being forced to live out this narrative, however, is a metaphor for post-apocalyptic survival. I disagree with both Ellie and Abby's vendettas, their hostility and ruthlessness, but I must perform the actions required to move the story forward. Here in this final scene, Ellie's fighting Abby to avenge Joel's death, and I keep hoping that Ellie will give up and they will somehow make up. As Ellie, I wish I could make a different choice. I wish I could stand back and not attack. It creates a cognitive dissonance for me as a player because I still have to control Ellie. The optics of this fight between two barely dressed women rolling around in the water can, in some ways, remind the player of fetish oil wrestling. The intensity that the scene creates is highly intimate and charged, but definitely very far away from being sexualized. Both women are desperate survivors fighting to retain a shred of their humanity. Sarah Ahmed talks about sticky affect and how certain concepts, certain words, have affect already associated with them. Affect is that interesting quality of things to exert emotional pressure on us. Game violence has sticky affect. While it's routine, it can also make you feel sick. Gender representation has sticky affect in the very fact that we puppeteer the avatar and she has to obey the commands we input. As Gil says, there is no control outside of gendering, no violence outside of gendering. In its effort to avoid sexualization, the game makes Ellie and Abby so filthy, so broken, so abject. They have their own affect that repels, but it doesn't feel prejudiced or sexist. Rather, it's intense and authentic. After all, nobody looks sexy in the zombie apocalypse.